How you handle people who trigger you, that's your call. But at least know that you're the one with all the explosives inside you. And you gain so much liberation if you find out what that ammunition is and how you got it. You can actually diffuse that ammunition inside you through getting to know yourself. And that's where freedom actually lies. If nobody had the power to trigger you, not because you were closed down and shut down and isolated, but because you're totally aware of yourself, well, that's where liberation actually is. Trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. It's a constriction in your mental capacity to respond in the present moment from your authentic self. Essentially, trauma is a restriction of your authentic self in the present moment. That's what trauma is. The capacity to be present with and understand and see the other human being for exactly who they are, and to accept them for who they are, and to invite them unconditionally to be in your presence exactly the way they are. That's what love actually is. But you have to believe in your own truth, and you have to deepen your relationship to your truth. And you'll connect with people that are also seeking the same truth as you are, even if they don't see it the way you do. So never be afraid of your own truth, and to explore it. And at the same time, whatever you do out there in the world, do an equal amount of work internally. Because if you don't, your work in the world will not be as effective. A quote, which I love, it's from one of my favorite teachers, and his name is A.H. Almas. And he says, your conflicts, all the difficult things, the problematic situations in your life are not chance or haphazard. They're actually yours. They're specifically yours, designed specifically for you by a part of you that loves you more than anything else. The part of you that loves you more than anything else has created roadblocks to lead you to yourself. You're not going to go in the right direction unless there's something pricking you in the side telling you, look here, this way. That part of you loves you so much that it doesn't want you to lose the chance. It will go to extreme measures to wake you up. It will make you suffer greatly if you don't listen. What else can it do? That's its purpose. I found this to be true of physical illness and mental problems and everything. You got to see what is the teaching here. So we can look at all these things as problems to get rid of, which is what the personality wants to do, or we can look at them as learning opportunities, which is what your true self wants to do. Now, two things. One is you talked about intention in life. So my wife and I had a holiday recently in Costa Rica. Partly it was a working holiday, but partly it was just a holiday. Traditionally, we've had terrible times during holidays. Partly because of my workaholism, and once I go into a holiday, I just collapse, and now my wife is dragging a corpse around. So this time, we actually went into the holiday with intention. This has nothing to do with psychedelics. Just to do that, we set an intention. What is our intention? And if we have an intention, I've learned from a couple of very wise teachers, what structures do we want to set up to support our intention? And how are we going to handle when there's kind of disagreement or conflict? We had a beautiful holiday because it was the first intentional holiday that we've had. So that intention in life in general is absolutely essential. Like every morning, what is my actual intention? This is something I do in my groups or when I teach. I ask people to tell me some recent episode when they're upset with somebody with their lives. Something that they're open to sharing. So it doesn't have to be anything sordid or something, but just something, whether it's your spouse, partner, the bus driver, a friend. Okay, so what happened?
There were a number of issues in my home, broken aspects of the home, things that were falling apart or needed to be fixed. Physically.
Okay, yeah.
Right. And I had hired someone to do these things while I was gone.
Okay.
And I came back and none of them were fixed.
Okay. And your emotional reaction was?
Anger.
Rage. Anger, okay. Anything else besides anger?
Frustration. I was disappointed.
Disappointed is sadness. Well, disappointed is not so much an emotion as a state of mind. I'm asking what the emotions were. What's inside disappointment? Something didn't happen. I wanted it to happen. How do I feel? Isn't there sadness there?
Yeah, sadness.
So there's anger and sadness. Those are the emotions. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask you a silly question. What were you sad and angry about? What does that mean that they didn't fulfill their commitments?
They didn't care about me. They didn't they didn't respect me.
So they didn't care about you and didn't respect you. What kind of person doesn't get cared or respected?
Someone who doesn't deserve to be cared for or respected.
Exactly. Somebody unworthy, right? If there are other people here, which there usually are when I do this exercise, I would ask them, okay, we just listened to Tim tell us about this experience. Are there other reasons why this other person might not have done the work that has nothing to do with him or her not caring about him or not respecting him? So what other reasons might there be?
1,000,001.
Name one.
Yeah, he could be in the hospital.
He could be in the hospital.
His
What else?
partner cared one could have been in a car accident.
Exactly.
He had a flight delay and got caught on Puerto Rico during a hurricane.
He's got ADHD.
Yeah.
He can't follow through. He's under stress and he couldn't. Okay, and any number of possibilities.
Yeah.
Now, of all the possibilities that you've just outlined, including that they don't care about you or respect you, which is the worst one? So let's notice something. I should say we, because we're all like this, we don't respond to what happens. We respond to our perception of what happens. Okay? That's what the Buddha said. It's with our minds we create the world. So that if you'd found out he had ADHD or he was stressed or, you might have been sad for him, but you would not have been angry and you would not have been sad. So, first of all, we don't respond to what happens. We respond to our perception of what happens, to our interpretation of what happens. Number one. Number two, of all the possible interpretations, we choose the worst one. Thirdly, what I just said isn't true. We didn't choose it. It's not like you went through all these possibilities and you said...
It wasn't multiple choice I chose.
You didn't do that. Your brain jumped there automatically, right? The question is why?
Yeah.
Now, here's the learning. First time in your life that you felt hurt and angry that when you perceived somebody didn't care about you or didn't respect you? Or has it happened before? And most people I talk to, it goes back way back into childhood. And that's what trauma is. We don't respond to the present moment. We respond to the past. But along the lines of our discussion, it's a beautiful learning opportunity. Now you get to know. Now, what if you assumed for a moment that you're the most lovable, most worthy of care, most worthy of respect person in the history of the universe, and this guy doesn't do your home? What's your response?
Any number of the other options which does not trigger an intense negative emotional state.
Yeah. So something in you, I would argue, still believes that you're not worthy of care and respect, and that's what gets triggered. So who's the one that doesn't care about you, and who's the one that doesn't think you're worthy of respect?
No, it'd be me.
It'd be you. No, that's a learning.
No, it is.
And this is exactly what you're talking about. You're saying how these difficult things, how these problems are always teaching opportunities. And that's the beauty of healing, is that when you reframe things and you actually see the source within ourselves, all of a sudden, that's liberating. Because guess what? If you're feeling that way because this guy did this or didn't do that, that makes you a victim. But if you see that you're the source, now you're powerful. So whether you're going to hell or you're on the way to heaven, it all happens up here, which is such a powerful teaching, because this is what we can work on. If we're victims of the world, Ramana Maharshi, who's a great Indian guru, he said something like, if your foot hurts when you walk outside, you can do two things. One is to wrap the whole world in burlap, or you can get a pair of shoes. You can see yourself as the victim of the world and trying to change the world so that they won't hurt you anymore, or you can actually empower yourself. And that's what the healing is all about. And anybody listening, I just want to know, it doesn't matter what state of mind you're in, it doesn't matter what you're experiencing, it's human, it is transmutable, it is transformable, because that true self that you got disconnected from is still available to you. So it's not a question of just talking about what happened in the past. It's a question of how do we reconnect to ourselves. And what you're describing about your own state, if I can put it in one sentence, you'd probably agree with me that you're probably much more connected to yourself than you used to be.
100%.
Yeah.
100%.
That's
the prerequisite. I mean, that's why I feel the way I described.
Exactly. I hope people will listen to this interview in a very personal sense, and that the discussion with you will help people look at themselves in maybe a new way. So rather than self-judgment about stuff that went wrong or they did to themselves or others, they get curious. What made me do that? They get curious compassionately, because we were all born innocent, and we were all born just wanting to be loving and loved. And then something happens, and then it's a hard road back. But I hope that this conversation helps people reconnect with that path, or encourage them to continue on it. And then secondly, not to see it as an individual issue. It's a social issue. We live in a society that really does disconnect people. And so it's not just an individual problem or an individual family problem. It's multi-generational. We never even talked about the multi-generational nature of trauma, what it is. We pass this on from one generation to the next, not because we intend to, but because we can't help it. So it needs to be looked at in deep over the generations and broadly as the function of a whole society. So that the Buddha said that without the many, there cannot be the one, without the one, there cannot be the many. And he talked about the interconnected co-arising of phenomena. So we are social creatures, our brains are wired together. So whatever you're dealing with, you have to look at not just the individual internal environment, but also the broader social and cultural environment of which you're one particular manifestation. The point of compassion inquiry is precisely to drill down to those core stories that people tell themselves. Is to actually get them to see what story they're telling themselves unconsciously, what those beliefs are, where they came from, and show them, guide them to the possibility of letting go of those stories, or letting go of the hold that those stories have on them. It's simply a method of drilling down. When I say drilling, I don't mean like a dentist. Although pain can come up, but the difference between this method and the dentist is that the dentist necessarily causes pain in the course of their work, and so most often they numb people before they do their work. Well, here it's the opposite. It's not that we cause pain, but pain may emerge, and we don't want you to be numb. If the pain emerges, we want you to feel that pain. However, the assumption is that we don't have to cause it, it's already there. And very often the stories we tell ourselves are attempts to get away from the pain. I mean, I'm talking about the conscious stories, to get away from the pain or someone to manage it. And those efforts to manage the pain, not to feel it, then are the basic cause of illness. Whether physiological illness, well, all illnesses are physiological, but whether the obviously identified illnesses like autoimmune disease, neurological illness, from multiple sclerosis to chronic skin conditions, these all have unresolved and unrecognized emotional underpinnings. And in my view, those underpinnings are rooted very strongly in a person's childhood. Not just in a sense of emotional dynamics and the stories we tell ourselves, but even very often in our very physiology. I gave a talk in Vancouver on addiction, and a woman came up to me and she told me she said cancer 3 times. She is the type that just can't say no, that is always succumbing to other people's demands and expectations. I write about that in my book, When the Body Says No. This is the basis of a lot of illness. And Julie Gottman today over breakfast, she said, well, she calls it the TNS, the Terminal Niceness Syndrome. And this woman fit the type. And she says, I can't stop doing it. I can't say no. I can't say no, for example, to my boss's expectations. She says, I don't understand it. I've been chanting 2 hours a day for 20 years. She's been doing spiritual work, without which her life might be a lot more difficult, might be a lot less balanced. Nevertheless, she's still unable to utter the word no, despite 20 years of chanting. Well, that's spiritual bypass. That's where you do the spiritual work, and you might attain great states of even oneness, or peace, serenity, joy. And it may be true for you that it has really transformed your life, and it can even be true that it has transformed your life, but not in certain areas. And where the spiritual work has not transformed your life sufficiently, it could be for 2 reasons. Maybe you haven't practiced well or long enough, or maybe there's an emotional side that you haven't dealt with. Maybe there's some truth that you haven't yet glimpsed or known what to do with. And that's where the compassion inquiry complements the spiritual work. There will be at times when some heavy emotions may come up. When I say heavy emotions, I literally mean emotions that are hard to bear and, hard to carry. That's okay. In fact, it's probably a sign of lack of depth on our part if that doesn't happen for some of you. Not that we intend to cause it, it's just that it's going to happen. So let's just talk about right now about what happens and how to manage it if that happens for you. So first of all, there's nothing wrong. If you get triggered, that's the buzzword these days, that's perfectly all right. But on the other hand, for the person being triggered, you might want to consider what a trigger actually is. So the metaphor comes from what? It comes from weaponry. It comes from, instruments of war. And the trigger actually is a very small part of the mechanism. In the gun or the rifle or the pistol or the revolver, machine gun, there's a whole mechanism to deliver the ammunition. There's the ammunition itself. There's something explosive that'll propel the ammunition to its target. Then there's a trigger which is this big. Whenever you get triggered, somebody pulled that trigger, perhaps. But who's the one carrying the ammunition? Who's the one with the mechanism to deliver the ammunition? Who's the one with the explosive material inside them? And where do you want to put your attention? You want to put your attention on the trigger purely? Or are you curious about what ammunition, what explosive material you're carrying inside? So triggers are really great to work with if you want to get to know yourself. And if you don't want to get to know yourself, then what we usually do is we just resent whoever did the triggering and that we think they did this to us. How you handle people who trigger you, that's your call. But at least know that you're the one with all the explosive inside you. And you gain so much liberation if you find out what that ammunition is and how you got it and whether you can really diffuse it. Like you diffuse a bomb, you can actually diffuse that ammunition inside you through getting to know yourself. And that's where freedom actually lies. If nobody had the power to trigger you, not because you were closed down and shut down and isolated, but because you're totally aware of yourself. Well, that's where liberation actually is. And that's what all the spiritual teachers, I believe, want to educate people to do in their particular way. Here we do it differently. Here we do what I would call the archaeology of the mind. The archaeologist has got some very fine tools, and they're very careful. They don't just dig in there with a big shovel and apply force. It's more like a very gentle dusting off of tiny little objects and looking at them, what it's really about, and seeing how they all fit together. And maybe what were broken fragments really are a beautiful vase once the archaeologist has finished their work. And in this case, you're being invited to be your own archaeologist of the mind. I found my mother's diary recently. When I was 6 weeks old, and this is 1944, my mother is writing, "My poor little Gabor, you've been crying since 3 in the morning. My heart broke for you. But I couldn't pick you up to feed you until 5 o'clock because the doctors would be so angry with me because I learned to feed you on schedule rather than on demand. And I didn't want to displease the doctors, so I had to let you cry for almost 2 hours. And finally at 4:45, my heart broke and I couldn't do it anymore, and I picked you up and fed you, but don't think I'll do it again." Now, what's the message to a 6 weeks old who's desperate for maternal contact, and this woman who absolutely adored me, who did everything she could to save my life under very difficult circumstances that I already talked to you about before, wartime Hungary, Nazi occupation, who absolutely loved me, and she's absolutely hurting me at the same time. And just how confusing that is for the infant. Now, you tell a mother bear to ignore the crying of the infant. You tell a mother cat to ignore the crying of the infant. Every fiber in my mother's being wanted to pick me up and nurture me, but because the doctors had told her not to. And this is how we tell parents now how to parent. We tell them to sleep train their kids by not picking them up. Hunter-gatherer tribes, you know what they do? They never even put their kids down. In the state of nature, creatures don't put their kids down. That doesn't mean you're permissive. The kid wants a cookie before dinner, and you know better. You give him a cookie, he won't have dinner. You're not going to give him the cookie. But why shouldn't he be angry about it? Why should I be threatened by his anger? Why should I call that naughty? Why should I call that the terrible twos? Oh, you're angry, you're really upset, you really wanted that cookie. Yeah, that's okay. Well, I'm so sorry, it's after dinner, in other words, you're not permissive, but you're also not demanding that the child suppress their feelings in order to be in your presence.
And you don't hold the relationship as ransom to them.
That's exactly it.
That's the dangerous thing.
You don't use the relationship against them.
So I went on holiday this year. 1 week I spent with some family in kind of a weird camp place in Germany, and the next week was in Bordeaux. I'll be honest, 4 days later, I left and flew back to London alone because I couldn't be the holiday dad.
If you could recognize in that experience that there's something that's still missing for you in terms of your self-awareness, then that could be a teaching experience. And I know that holiday boredom that you described. When I go on holiday, it actually takes me a while to relax into it. Now the problem is when you're with 5 other people or 4 other people, and you also have to be there for them, when you can't even be there for yourself, then you have a real dilemma. And you're either pretending to be the holiday dad, or you're being miserable. I understand the dilemma, but I'm not sure that you want to stay that way for the rest of your life, because you got these 2 young kids, and what's the message to them? And that is restless around them.
That it's their fault.
Yeah. And Thich Nhat Hanh, the spiritual teacher, the Buddhist teacher, said that the greatest gift a parent can give to their child is his or her own happiness. And when you're restless and unhappy around your kids, as I have been, they get a message that it's about them. So that's something good to recognize, as long as you take it on as a challenge.
One thing my wife does is when Caden's he has a meltdown sometimes on the sidewalk next to traffic. And so she just talks to him. Okay, I know you're really angry, Caden. And that might take 5 minutes. But when he's talking, she's like, okay, I know you're really angry, but we need to go. So I understand you're angry. And he's like, ah! And she just tries to talk. And then after a while, he's listening, or hears the tone.
That's the whole point. He's responding as much to the energy and the tone as he is to the words. And what she's teaching him is self-regulation. He's actually teaching that you can go through these states, it's okay, they'll pass. And this is how self-regulation happens. Not by, you mustn't yell, you mustn't cry, and so on, this kind of punitive and accusatory stuff. Your wife's doing intuitively what needs to be done. What she's doing is instead of a time out, she's giving a time in. She's actually giving him her energy and her concern and her presence at that time, which is exactly what the child needs. And that way he'll learn self-regulation. Whereas when you react against his anger, all you're teaching him is self-suppression, which is not the same as self-regulation.
I got a stepdaughter when she was 6.
Right.
She's now 14. Mm-hmm. And you said some interesting things about stepchildren and stepfathers earlier.
Well, step is an interesting word, because why do we call them step-parents? Because they step into the role of the parent. And in this book, Hold On to Your Kids, what we point out is that parenting is not a role, it's a relationship. So sometimes, I've seen very often the step-parent steps into the role and expects deference and compliance and love from the child. But why should the child offer them? She didn't ask you to marry her mother. That was her mother's decision, maybe for perfectly valid reasons, but let's not assume that the child is necessarily a party to it. And if you want to step into the role of parenting, you have to develop the relationship where the child wants to belong to you, where the child's attachment drive is directed towards you. And then you'll be the parent. But let's not assume that it's a role that simply you can start doing the right things without a relationship. And Krishnamurti, the great teacher, said that the most important thing is relationship. And he said that without understanding relationship, any plan of action will only breed conflict. So it's that relationship that we have to get. So that 6-year-old whose mother married you at that age has already been through that difficult time because her parents divorced. Now, I don't need to know the circumstances, but I can tell you, no adults divorce without a fair bit of unhappiness. I mean, no two happy parents wake up Saturday morning and say, it's been wonderful, I'm totally in love with you, goodbye. There's usually a period of alienation and stress and struggle and rancor. And the child has to endure all that. And the child has endured the loss, well, assuming that the father didn't die or something. But one way or the other, the child, the 6-year-old, has endured the loss. Then you come along, and all of a sudden the mother forms a relationship with you. Why should that not be threatening to the child? She's already lost something, and all of a sudden there's a stranger in the home whom mommy really loves. Well, every reason she might perhaps perceive you as a threat. Now, maybe she didn't. Maybe you formed a great relationship with her right from the beginning, and maybe she welcomed you into the home. But it can easily work the other way. In other words, all I'm saying is we have to understand that the parents' relationship with one another is not immediately transferable to the child. That a relationship is to build with the child. And that's what then gives you the power to parent, is the relationship that the child wants to give you and maintain with you. The power of parenting comes from the desire of the child to belong to you. And this is whether you're the step-parent or the biological parent. My wife said to me, literally she said to me, addressing my workaholism, she said, look, you gotta realize you're a workaholic. And so that challenged me. And so I really had to make a decision of what kind of life do I really want. Now the work is very satisfying, and there's a lot of appreciation for it out there in the world. But at the same time, if I identify with it, if I make it my identity and who I am, I deplete myself and I suffer, and I impose suffering in my primary relationship as well. So I've really had to look at my life. So I have slowed down, and literally now every invitation I get has to be vetted and approved by my wife, which is not a matter of yielding control to her. It's a matter of recognizing that I need support in making these decisions. And as a result of that, I'm enjoying life a lot more. And at the beginning of your movie, Iron Man, John Joseph says that we have to suffer to seek the truth. Some words to that effect. And whether he knows it or not, he's quoting the great Greek playwright Aeschylus, who in his Agamemnon, the chorus says, we human beings suffer into truth. So literally, it was that suffering imposed by my workaholism that led me to have to make decisions and to understand the truth.
If you could pick up the phone and make a call to the 20-year-old Gabor and give that young man a bit of advice, what would you tell him? Where was he? Getting his medical degree.
No, he wasn't. He was, at that time, his ADD was too powerful. He couldn't go to medical school yet.
Really?
Because that took more concentration and discipline than I was ready for. I didn't go to medical school till I was 28. So what do I say to the 20-year-old? Look inside. At that time, I was going to save the world through politics. Not to ignore the politics, but pay at least as much attention internally or more than you're casting on the outside. And you don't have to work so hard to be liked and loved. You're okay. Just relax, kid, and allow life to come to you. You don't have to force it. And open your heart. Don't just focus on your clever brain so much. Open your heart and see what possibilities reveal themselves to you. And that it's not your fault. The way the world is, and even the way you are, it's not your fault. It's not a fault. Just accept yourself.
What is the best advice you've ever received in your life from a colleague, a coworker?
I'll tell you two things. One is I had an aunt who was a physician herself, and she had not wanted to be a doctor, she wanted to be a writer. But complying with her father's wishes, she went to medical school. And she was taken to Auschwitz, where she saw her parents taken in one direction, to the gas chambers, and she was sent in another. And very sensitive, very wounded soul. But she saw me much more clearly when I was young than I could see myself. And once she quoted Shakespeare to me, and I know it's a cliche, and I know that it's in the mouth of the character Polonius, in whom Shakespeare puts this phrase, it's even hypocrisy, but it's so true. And she said to me, she wrote to me, to thine own self be true. You know, I wish I had understood what that meant, but that's the best advice I got. And then when I was a physician, but the part of me that wanted to write hadn't really expressed himself, because that was really in me, to write and to share something with the world. And I had a patient who used to be an English professor at the University of British Columbia. He was quite a well-known Canadian poet, Warren Tallman. And I said to him when he came to the office once for a medical visit, I said, Warren, I want to write, but I don't know what. And he said, don't worry about it. He said, don't worry about it. He said, you will write when you have something to teach the world. And that's what happened. There's a lot of people out there who see the truth, but they don't control the media, and they don't write the scripts for most movies. So therefore, you might not get validation out there, but you have to believe in your own truth, and you have to deepen your relationship to your truth. And you'll connect with people that are also seeking the same truth as you are, even if they don't see it the way you do. So never be afraid of your own truth, and to explore it. Also, don't be afraid to let go of it if you find that there's a deeper truth that speaks to you. And at the same time, whatever you do out there in the world, do an equal amount of work internally. Because if you don't, your work in the world will not be as effective. There's one major source of illness, and I'm talking about any kind of illness, whether that's so-called mental illness or physical illness, and that's childhood trauma. And this is true whether I'm talking about anxiety, depression, ADHD, addiction, or if I'm talking about multiple sclerosis, cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia, and as I said, malignancy as well. Now that seems like a very bold statement, but I'll be concentrating on the physical side of it. When I say physical side, I'm talking about the illnesses that are not considered to be mental illnesses. And it's quite okay, I wish you would argue with me, both in your mind and also verbally. That's the way we get through to the heart of things. I'll be saying to you that just about everything, not everything, but just about everything that we call illness is rooted in compensations and adaptations that have to do with childhood trauma. The adaptations that children are forced to resort to in response to early stress help them endure that early duress and difficulty, but those same adaptations become source of pathology later on, and they even threaten longevity. In order to understand the basis of that, we have to consider how we look at human beings, and how we look at disease. Now, Western medicine looks at disease from a particular perspective, and you have to understand something about medicine. It's science, all right, but it's also ideology. And there's a difference between science and ideology. There's a lot of science in it, and it's great science, but there's also ideology. And ideology is a point of view. It's as the Germans say, it's a Weltanschauung. It's a worldview that you're not conscious of. That you have hidden beliefs that you don't question. And people that question the hidden beliefs are seen as outliers or mavericks. And that's an ideology. And that exists in all realms. So there's always ideological biases hidden in any system. And the logic of the system operates within those biases. Now, what are the biases of Western medicine? Well, the biases of Western medicine are, number one, that diseases have either physical causes in a sense of genes or external forces like bacteria or viruses or toxins, or we don't know what the causes are. So the causes are either physical or the disease is what we call idiopathic. We don't know what the source of it is. The second bias is that diseases happen to organs. So you have heart disease, and you have lung disease, and you have disease of the connective tissue or the liver or whatever. And then there's specialties designated to study in depth the diseases of these organs. So we separate the organ from the whole person. And then we separate the person from the environment, so that the social environment, we might acknowledge the role of the physical environment, but we certainly not acknowledge the role of the social environment. In Western medical terms, the average physician would not be able to explain to you, and this is not for lack of intelligence, simply for lack of training, would not be able to explain to you why is it that the more episodes of racism a black American woman experiences, the greater her risk for asthma. It's just a documented fact. Nor would the average physician be able to tell you very easily the multiple times documented fact that children whose parents are stressed are more likely to have asthma. As a matter of fact, the degree of the child's asthma has been correlated with the degree of mental disturbance on the part of the parent. So you go to the physician, you get the inhalers, but that's all that happens. The human beings can't be separated from their environment. And what happens inside an individual on a physiological level is very much determined, or at least affected by what happens to them on a social level. So, nor would the average physician be able to explain to you, based on their training, why is it that if you look at lung cancer, the more adverse childhood experiences that you have, in other words, the more trauma you've experienced, the greater your risk of lung cancer, and this is true even if you cancel out smoking as a factor. Nor would the average physician be able to say a whole lot about the fact that a Canadian study showed that if you were abused as a child, your risk of cancer goes up by nearly 50%. And this is even after you've factored in or factored out things like smoking and drinking, which abused people are more likely to do. At the same time, human beings have always known, we've always known that things can't be separated. So there's always been this tussle, you might say, between a unitary, holistic view of human beings and existence in general, and the dualistic view that separates things. So the Buddha said 2,500 years ago, he said, look at a leaf or a raindrop. He says, and meditate. He says, meditate on all the conditions that are necessary for the existence of that leaf or a raindrop. You look at a leaf, it contains the sun, the light, the photosynthesis. It contains the earth in the form of minerals, and it contains the sky in form of the water. So the leaf literally contains earth, sun, and sky. He says, the birth of any phenomenon, he says, is dependent on the birth of other phenomena. He says, without the many, there cannot be the one. Without the one, there cannot be the many. And that was the Buddha 2,500 years ago. And wonderful writer, Susan Griffin, in her really transcendent book, The Course of Stones, wrote that the story of one life cannot be told separately from the story of other lives. Who are we? The question is not simple. What we call the self is part of a larger matrix of relationships and society. All the lives that surround us are in us. There's a significant difference between an experience between a family physician and a specialist, in that the specialist certainly does know, and blessedly so, a lot about a certain organ and a certain system, but they don't know the patient. And by the time they see the patient's already sick, and usually they already have a diagnosis. At least we know what area the disease is. As the family physician, you get to see people before they get sick. So you know what their personalities are like for years before they get sick. And also you get to see them in the context of their families, including their multi-generational family of origin. Let me just ask you right now, how many of you in the last 5 years have been to a cardiologist, a neurologist, a gastroenterologist, a dermatologist, maybe I said rheumatologist, any kind of an ologist? Just put your hand up. Okay, great. All right. Now, put your hand up again if they asked you about childhood trauma. One person, that's great. If they asked you about stresses in your relationship with your spouse, about job stress, like a 5 to 10%, and that's really good if they ask you about it. And I wonder how long they took the discussion, but it doesn't even occur to them. But I'm telling you, all of you who went to these specialists were there because of childhood trauma. Virtually all of you. Now, there are diseases that you can't put into that category. There are genetic diseases. If you have the gene, you'll have the disease. It's nothing to do with life or stress. It's just, although that can affect the course of it, but whether you get it or not is simply genetic. Those diseases are extraordinarily rare. Like 1 in 10,000 of the population will have a disease like that. Most diseases have little or nothing to do with genetic factors. So these are then the patterns that I noticed in my clients. And by the way, when I said childhood trauma, probably some of you are at least internally shaking your heads because you're looking at your life, and I never had any trauma. Because it all depends on how you use the word trauma. And trauma, for me, and that's a whole other lecture, but trauma is not what happens to you. It's what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. And things can happen inside you for which you don't need very dramatic events. But trauma essentially is a restriction of your capacity. It's a limitation. It's a constriction in the body. It's a constriction in your mental capacity to respond in the present moment from your authentic self. Essentially, trauma is a restriction of your authentic self in the present moment. That's what trauma is.
When it comes to my relationship with my children, is that first lesson of happiness is the greatest gift I can give them.
Yeah.
Those first 7 years are very important. Are there other things?
Actually, the first 7 years are crucial. I would say the first 3 years are the nub of it. I always say to people, you get the first 3 years right, you can relax. If you don't get the first 3 years right, you'll be practicing remedial parenting for decades.
And what does screwing it up look like? And how would you know?
Well, first of all, you'd know because there I am with my son, and I'm not finding rest in it. So I don't know how to be there with him. I don't know how to be there for him. And I was like that. I was always waiting for my kids to grow older when I could intellectually engage them, and now we'll have something in common. But the sheer act of being, or the sheer state of being, I could never achieve with them. And it's interesting because I look at my brothers. They're so wonderful with little kids. They're so spontaneously there for them. I never knew how to do that. Because the real relationship doesn't depend on words. It depends on the capacity to be with.
And they can sense just that energy from you. I'm just here with you.
Yeah.
And I'm here.
And I welcome your presence.
Right.
And I welcome you to exist in my presence. And I'm overjoyed to have you in my presence. That's what the child needs from the parent.
And that's communicated with body language and everything.
And through the energy that you exude.
And they can feel it.
They can absolutely feel it.
Wow.
They can't name it, but they can feel it.
Okay, and that already starts changing their personality right there.
That shapes their personality.
They always say that mothers form a different bond than fathers. Is that just another way, an anachronism?
Mothers form a different bond, but only because mothers are present with their kids. Whereas the fathers tend to visit the kids. I mean, the father goes to work typically and then visits at home for a couple of hours and then takes off again next morning. Those fathers who stay home with their kids, they learn how to mother their kids. So it's not a gender issue, it's a relational issue. And the mothers allow themselves to be trained by the kids, whereas the fathers tend to impose their own expectations on the kid. This is not universal, I'm talking by and large. So those fathers who have the good fortune, like in the civilized countries where parents are given paternity leave, those fathers learn to relate to their kids in a different way than the average father somewhere else.
Okay.
We can be trained, but we have to be present for the training. In our culture, the children have a need to attach. They have a need to connect with somebody, because without that connection, they don't survive. And in the hunter-gatherer bands where human beings evolved, those attachments were with adults. And not just one adult or two adults, but with a whole set of nurturing adults. Now in our culture, We've deprived the kids of the parental presence for the most part. And the child's brain can't handle an attachment void where there's no attachment figure. And in the absence of the parent or the nurturing adult, the child will fill that void with the peer group. Now kids become far more peer attached than is healthy for them. And now peers become their models and their mentors and their templates for how to be, how to walk, and how to talk. And as that happens, the kids push away from the parents because they're more minded to belong to the peer group, which has different values from the parents. And the kid's brain can't handle that competition. So the brain of the child will actually choose the peer group over the parent group. And where that goes, you can see on Facebook, and you can see it in the teenage gangs, and you can see it in the increasing frustration of parents who've lost the power to parent, because parents think that their power to parent comes from the fact that they have the responsibility and the strength and the wisdom. It doesn't come from that. The power to parent comes from the desire of the child to belong to you. When the child is driven to belong to the peer group, because we've taken him out of his natural context, we lose the power to parent. What do we do then? We ratchet up the pressure, we become more authoritarian. We lose the authority, so we become authoritarian. And the more authoritarian we become, the more pressure we put on them, the more they resist. And now we label them with oppositional defiant disorder, and we call them obstreperous and bad and naughty kids. All they're doing is acting out their attachment dynamics. So if we want to discipline kids, we actually have to make them our disciples. And the disciple is not somebody who's afraid of you. The disciple is somebody who loves you and wants to belong to you and follow you. So discipline is the very opposite of punishment. First of all, you realize that the most important template, in fact, the essential template for the emotional development of the child, as well as for the brain's healthy physiological development, is a nurturing relationship with mutually responsive adults. That is the template for physiological brain development and healthy psychological development. That means that anything that you do that undermines the relationship with the child will actually undermine the child's development, because it makes the child insecure, and kids in state of insecurity are in defensive flight or fight mode, in which mode they don't learn anything. They just are defending. And so that every time I use the relationship against the child, so I have a 2-year-old who's angry, and most psychologists and experts will tell you, time out. In other words, what they're telling you is withdraw the relationship from the child as a way of threatening the child. And that threat will make the child comply with you. Well, the child may temporarily comply with you, but what have you taught her? You've taught her that the relationship is conditional, that they're only acceptable to you if they please you. Furthermore, you've taught them that relationships are unstable and unreliable. And they've learned that you're not available for them when they're most upset. Because why is he acting out? Why is he throwing a tantrum? Because they're frustrated about something, because they're angry about something, because they're unhappy. And you say to them, when you're most unhappy, that's when I'm least available to you. And this is how parents are taught to parent. Furthermore, parents are taught not to pick up their kids when they're crying. Let them sleep it out. Just utterly noxious. Yeah. Because the child who you don't pick up, right, what lesson do they get? Their emotions don't matter. That's the lesson they get. Just the opposite of what any loving parent wants to teach. So that the psychology, the parenting psychology in this culture has become anti-child. What I found out is that whether it was physical illness or addiction or mental illness of any kind, or the preponderance of childhood developmental disorders that are burgeoning in North America right now, with millions of children being on stimulant medications for ADHD, 500,000 kids in your country are on antipsychotic medications, not because they're psychotic, but because we don't know. When I say we, I mean doctors, teachers, parents don't know how to regulate the child's behavior without medications. And it's an experiment because we have no idea what the long-term effects of antipsychotics will be on the developing brain of the child. The approach always is, somebody gets rheumatoid arthritis, well, what do we do about it? Well, we give them steroid medications, or we give them immune suppressant medications, because in rheumatoid arthritis, the immune system attacks the body. So we want to suppress the immune system so it stops attacking the body of the host. With ADHD, what do we do about it? Well, there's something going on in the brain. Let's change the chemistry of the brain by stimulant medications, which can make a helpful difference, actually. But our response to any of these issues, whether it's physical, mental illness, childhood developmental problems, behavior issues, is always reactive. It's always reactive, like we're reacting to manifestations. So there was a case somewhere in the States, not unusual, by the way, where a kid somewhere in the States, 8 or 9-year-old or 10-year-old, is in handcuffs by the school security officer. This same thing is happening up in Canada. We're just reacting to the behavior. And with due deference to BK, when he said, well, trauma is wrong, let's talk about solutions. That's not my approach at all. And I'm saying, for God's sake, let's just look at it first. Get present to it. Be aware of it. See how it arises. And then, out of that understanding, will come the solutions. American psychiatrist Thomas Hora said, when you get the what, then you know the how. And in North America, we're very addicted to the how, but not to the what. We don't really understand things. We don't look deeply enough. We just react to symptoms, behaviors, manifestations that are troublesome, that we don't like, that are pathological. And there's not a look at the source. So here's what I found out. That whether we're looking at mental illness, depression, anxiety, PTSD, ALS, cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, behavior problems, we're looking at one thing only, which is the impact of early childhood stress on the individual. And that stress happens in a social context. And so that the ideology of Western medicine, which separates the mind from the body, which doesn't understand that there are physical manifestations of lifelong emotional patterns and early stresses that the disease itself is an outcome of, and that therefore, if the individual could change their relationship to their emotions and how they function in the world, and how they take on stress automatically, and what kind of relationships they're in, and what kind of work they're doing, and how they feel about themselves, that can actually significantly affect the course of the illness in a positive sense. In other words, if they get present to themselves. But these are the things that my profession, despite a whole preponderance of evidence, absolutely ignores. It just doesn't compute. Let's say you have a 2-year-old, and you're the parent of a 2-year-old, and they get angry with you. Incidentally, if your 2-year-old doesn't get angry with you, you're not doing your job. Because she can't have that second cookie before dinner. And why should she not be upset? I mean, when you want something, you don't get it, you get frustrated. Right? She gets frustrated, so But what if you grew up in a home where your father or mother was a rageaholic, and so that you're terrified of anger? You can't handle it. It brings up too much anxiety for you. So then you give the signal, overtly or covertly, that good little girls don't get angry. What the child gets is that little girls who get angry don't get loved. So then how does she adapt? She adapts by repressing her anger. That's the way she maintains the relationship with you. Because the fundamental dynamic in human life and the most important factor in the development and existence of human beings is attachment, connection to another human being. As infants, we're utterly helpless, and we're more helpless than any other creature, and stay that way longer than any other creature. So without that attachment relationship, we simply don't function, can't live. It's life essential. And throughout life, of course, we evolved as a species of attachment. By attachment meaning it's a gravitational force that pulls two bodies together, just like love is the common word for attachment, connection, where somebody's taking care of somebody else, somebody's holding somebody else, and somebody's being held. Now, gravitation itself is an attachment force. I'm talking about physical gravitation. It pulls two bodies together. And literally, it's gravitation that makes the world go around the sun, isn't it? So when they say love makes the world go around, it's true in the purest physical sense. Well, it's also true in the psychological realm. And by love here, I don't mean the emotion that a parent feels towards the child, because I take it for granted that all parents love their kids. And even the hard as it is to fathom, but even the parents who abuse their kids love their kids. They just don't know how else to love them because they're acting out their own childhood programming. So by love here, in this case, I don't mean the emotion. I mean the capacity to be present with and understand and see the other human being for exactly who they are, and to accept them for who they are and to invite them unconditionally to be in your presence exactly the way they are. That's what love actually is. And so I can tell you as a parent, I was completely incapable of giving that to my kids because I was still dealing with my own childhood stuff as an adult. When children don't receive that unconditional, what Carl Rogers called the unconditional positive regard, or the unconditional invitation to be in my presence exactly the way you are, then they have to adapt to that. Why do they have to adapt? Because they need the attachment relationship without which they can't survive. So without attachment, there's no survival. Therefore, we adapt. And if your child gets the message that she's not invited to be in your presence when she's angry, then she won't be angry. Not that the anger won't be there, but she'll repress it. It's not a conscious behavior, it's simply an automatic brain mechanism. Now, when you repress anger, you know what happens in the long term? You're repressing your immune system. Lots of studies have shown that. And the immune system can then fail to function, or it can actually turn against you in the form of autoimmune illness. That's in a nutshell the source of a lot of physical illnesses. Not the only source, but it's a major contributing factor that's utterly ignored in Western medicine, despite reams of evidence. So what I'm saying here is that when there's a loss emotionally, that translates into biology. So it's not that there's biology here and no emotions here. It's that the emotions and the biology are completely inseparable. And what happens on the emotional plane inevitably will have its manifestations on a biological plane. So what you lose emotionally translates into biological events in your body. You can use social media responsibly just as you can exercise responsibly, or you can exercise addictively, or you can use social media addictively. So it's their internal relationship to them, these activities, that defines whether they're addictive or not. Now, if you're using something for temporary relief or pain relief or pleasure, and you crave it, despite negative consequences, you go on addiction. Whereas if you're using social media not to escape emotional distress, not because you're craving it, but simply because it's a useful modality, and you don't suffer negative consequences, then it's not an addiction. So it's not the external behavior. I mean, you can drink alcohol not addictively. You can have sex not addictively. You can go shopping not addictively. Or you can engage in all those activities in a purely compulsive, addictive fashion, depending on what the internal dynamic is. Does it provide temporary pleasure, pain relief? Do you crave it? And do you continue with it despite negative consequences? That's what tells you whether it's an addiction or not. Now, broadly speaking, social media are highly addictive, and a lot of people are addicted, and it having a devastating effect on their lives. If you define addiction as I do, as any behavior that a person craves, finds temporary pleasure or relief in, suffers negative consequences, and cannot give up despite negative consequences, that's an addiction. Again, I don't care whether it's sex, gambling, ideology, or cocaine. And the brain circuits are the same. The same brain circuits are involved in all the addictions. So we think there's all these different addictions. If you actually look at the addicted brain, it's the same brain circuit that's involved in all addictions. So an ideology that allows you free expression of your impulses. You will get to hit somebody if you're angry. You get to throw a rock through somebody's window, or a verbal bomb to their personal sense of self. If you're lacking a sense of personal power, but the ideology gives you a pseudo-empowerment, now you belong to something really important. If there's no meaning in your life, and the ideology gives you a pseudo-meaning, if you're lacking genuine pleasure in your life, and you get the pseudo-pleasure of connecting with people who see things the same way, an ideology can function like an addiction. And furthermore, it invites denial, just like addiction always invites denial. When I was in my addicted behavior, which I have been, I was in total denial that I was an addict. To me, it was just the natural thing to do. It doesn't matter what the cost was to the people around me. Ideologies can do the same thing. You're in total denial about the impact on yourself or on others. So yeah, ideology can function like an addiction. There's an American psychologist who had that human beings are all creatures with special needs. And I think one of our special needs is for meaning. Our lives are not meant to be just lived for the daily sake of physical existence. Now, that meaning in a tribal setting is automatically provided for you because you're bigger than yourself and you belong to something greater than yourself. And when you're connected with nature, or you're connected with some spiritual practice or belief, you have some meaning that transcends your daily struggles for survival. Now, this society has pretty much reduced that. Like we talk about meaning a lot, and we talk about broad values such as freedom and democracy and so on, but that's not what people experience in their daily lives. Nobody experiences democracy in their daily lives. Mostly people work in institutions where they're told what to do, and they have no voice in the matter whatsoever. And the freedom is very often reduced to making choices between meaningless alternatives. And there's more and more disconnection, as we've already mentioned. So there's a deep lack of meaning in people's lives. The addictions can certainly come along and provide a false, temporary, but momentarily satisfactory sense of meaning. And meaning is important to all of us. We all want to feel there's something more significant about our lives than simply the fact that we have dinner in the evening and we defecate in the morning. First of all, what's the case in this society is that people are less and less connected. Human beings were not meant to live in these, from the evolutionary point of view, we're not designed to live in these complex, vast aggregations. We're meant to live in small hunter-gatherer bands where everybody knows everybody else, and there's deep connection between people. And that's how we've lived, for the most part, for millions of years, hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of years of evolution, until really quite recently. So there's a lot of disconnect in this society. People literally don't know their neighbors. Neighborhoods are no longer neighborhoods. They're isolated domiciles, for the most part, which means there's a deep hunger for connection, and the social media provides a simulacrum of connection, the pretense of connection. And so what do people have on social media? They have friends. They like each other. These are attachment dynamics. These are connection dynamics. But the friends aren't real friends, because real friends know you, and you're not afraid to show them who you are. On social media, people have concocted an artificially adorned persona. And it's these artificial entities that then people like. So the individual never gets the sense of being really liked, because they know that it's just their image that's being liked. And the so-called friends are not there for you when you need them. And yet use the same language. Liking and friends are very strong language. But social media is a pale copy of them. So the less it meets your real needs, the more addictive it is, because the more and more what you need to get. Number one. Number two, I'm not sure that it's caused, but it's certainly revealed the many subcultures in this society and allows people who belong to various ideological groupings to identify one another and to band together and to have sort of a pseudo camaraderie. So we can all hate the same thing. We can all be hostile to the same people. And anybody can express an opinion. In the old days of letters to the newspapers, people had to be pretty responsible for what they wrote. They had to identify themselves. Social media, you can say anything you want about anybody. Doesn't matter how hurtful, how wrong, how hateful really, and not even identify yourself. So it allows people who otherwise are on the margins of society to aggregate in these pseudo groups that then promote one another's most negative tendencies. And there's no guidance there, there's no leadership, there's nobody to call you to your senses, there's nobody to say, really, do you really mean that? Is that what you really intend? What's really going on? So there's peer groupings without any kind of guidance. It's really like a teenage gang phenomenon where people band together mostly for negative reasons. They're lacking contact, so they need to band together, so that's legitimate. But they band together without mentorship, without tradition, without adult guidance. And so we see what we see. Well, you see, as you and I are speaking to each other, Ali, we're tracking each other's face. And our ear muscles are actually adjusting themselves automatically to hear not just what's being said, but also the tone of voice in which it's being said. And you will nod when I say something, or I might nod or smile when you say something. So communication is as much about these nonverbal cues, which are mediated through our nervous system, as it is about the verbal content. Now, none of that exists on social media. It's not genuine communication. Human communication is almost meant to be face-to-face. And even if I were to write a letter to somebody that I was going to mail, that's a much more conscious and deliberate process than dashing something off on social media and pushing the send button in a state of tizzy, so that it's much less impulsive. So social media really takes away the nuts and bolts of human communication and provides only the surface manifestation of it. So what masquerades as communication is really diatribes very often. And I know what it's like, because I get an email, and which might trigger me, and then right away I want to write it out and then push the send button. And boy, have I had to learn not to do that, because there's no reflection there. It's just whatever emotion arises, you express it and then you communicate it right away without any reflection. If I'm talking to somebody, as long as we're connected, by and large, I'm going to reflect on what I say before I say it. By and large, I'm going to be modulated by the fact that I'm talking to a real human being. And as I point in my book, what the addicts lack very often is emotional self-regulation. The parts of the brain that regulate our emotions, including the orbitofrontal cortex, just don't develop in addicted people because the conditions for development are adequate. So the brain does develop in interaction with the environment. So now you have a lot of people with brains that are not fully developed. They might be intellectually developed, but the emotional circuits aren't. So now you have a lot of people with emotional underdevelopment communicating impulsively on social media. And that's what we're seeing. And so people will say horrible things on social media that might never even say in real person to anybody. So an addiction is a complex psychological, physiological process, but which manifests in any behavior that a person enjoys, finds relief in, and therefore craves in the short term, but suffers negative consequences in the long term and doesn't give up despite the negative consequences. So craving pleasure, relief in the short term, negative consequences in the long term, inability to give it up. Now, notice I have said nothing about substances. I said any behavior. So it could be related to cocaine, marijuana, nicotine, alcohol, whatever. Could also be sex, gambling, internet, relationships, shopping, eating, work, extreme sports, working out, any number of human activities. So I said any behavior. Now, the official definition of addiction, according to the American Society for Addiction Medicine, is that this is primary brain disorder. It arises in the brain, largely due to genetic reasons. This is how they see it. And I say that's just not true. The other popular idea about addiction is that it's a choice that somebody makes, that people choose to be addicted, which is what the legal system is based on. Because if people are not choosing, what are we punishing them for? So although I think the medical definition is closer to the truth, I don't see it as it's a genetic disorder, and I don't see it as a primary brain disorder. So let me perhaps show you why, if that's okay. So I give you this definition of addiction. Again, craving relief, pleasure short-term, negative consequence long-term, inability to give it up. So in other words, the addiction is not the primary problem. It's an attempt to solve a problem. And then the real question is, how did the problem arise? In other words, this is where my theory is that it's always rooted in childhood trauma, and that the addiction is an attempt to deal with the effects of childhood trauma, which it does temporarily, while it creates even more problems in the long term. So there's a great link between ADD and addictions, and not just because they both begin with the same three letters. And I can tell you about my own ADHD. And this is where we go back to childhood again. So that tuning out, that absent-mindedness, that desire to scatter your attention all over the place, that's not a disease. They say it's an inherited disease. The hell it is. But let me give you a personal question again. If I were to become abusive towards you right now, verbally or otherwise, what would be your options right now? The rational response, if I were to become abusive, would be for you to just assert yourself, saying, don't talk to me that way. Or it would be to leave, saying, this interview is over, And if for some reason you had not the strength to do either of those, there's other people in the room here with us, you could ask for help.
Right.
But what if you couldn't escape, fight back, or seek help? Then you would shut down or tune out.
Right.
In other words, the tuning out is simply a defensive response on the part of the brain. Now put me back into my infancy, when my mother is so grief-stricken that I'm crying because she's in pain. The child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother or of anyone else he's with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. The organism does not develop the confidence that it can regulate itself, that things will happen the way they should, hence lack of optimism. My mother didn't abuse me. She did her best to look after me, but she was stressed, depressed, terrorized, grief-stricken. I'm picking that up as a sensitive infant. Can I fight back, change the situation, or escape? None of those. What can I do? Nothing I can do. My brain will tune out as a way of dealing with the stress. So I'm not talking about abuse here. I'm just talking about stress mothering or parenting. The child's brain then will tune out. When is the child's brain tuning out? When the brain is developing. So the tuning out then becomes programmed in as the default setting. And that's why ADD. So it's not an inherited disease. It's not a disease at all. It begins as a coping mechanism, which then gets programmed into the brain. And as a lot of these early coping mechanisms function, they help you in the short term create problems in the long term. And that's ADD is one of these examples. And of course, it also makes you more prone to be addicted, because now when you tune out, life becomes less interesting. You shut down emotionally, you protect yourself. Now you feel depressed. What does depression actually mean? You said you were depressed. What does depression mean? To depress something is to push it down. What do people push down in depression? They push down their emotions. Why would they? Because the emotions are too painful. So even depression becomes as a coping mechanism. You push it down so you don't feel the pain. But then later on, that interferes with your life functioning. So it all begins as a coping mechanism, and later on becomes a source of dysfunction. And all this is happening when the brain is actually developing. So these are the links I began to make, including after I was diagnosed with it. So and then despite the fact that a couple of my kids were diagnosed, I knew that this wasn't a genetic disease, that what it is actually is a coping mechanism which got programmed into the brain. And then when I read the literature on brain development, wow, turns out the human brain is shaped by the environment, and particularly by the adult-child relationships. And so it all began to make perfect sense to me. Let's go back to what I said, what you quoted me saying, not why the addiction, but why the pain. So if we understand that addiction in every case is rooted in some painful internal experience, and that when you ask people, what does the addiction do for you? They'll say, it numbs me, it soothes the pain, it makes me feel connected with other people, it gives me a sense of control, it gives me inner peace. Well, the lack of inner peace, the lack of control, the lack of connection, they're all forms of emotional pain. If I ask the question, not why the addiction, but why the pain, then that leads to an examination of that person's life, rather than looking just at the brain chemistry. They say growing scientific evidence demonstrates that social and physical environments that threaten human development because of scarcity, stress, or instability can lead to short-term physiologic and psychological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which may come at a significant cost to long-term outcomes in learning, behavior, health, and longevity. That's what I was saying before, that those early adaptations, like pushing down your feelings when the feelings are too painful, will help you as an infant, as a young child, but then they cause problems later on. The tuning out that you do to protect you from the stress in your environment, if you're very sensitive, it doesn't take a lot of stress, helps you endure, but in the long term becomes the problem. That's exactly what they're saying. And then this is so crucial, and it's so crucial because they still don't teach this in medical schools, even though scientifically it's not even vaguely controversial. The human brain develops in interaction with the environment. It's not genetically programmed purely. Here's what they say. The architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or a fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. Not some of the health learning, all the health learning. Now notice what they say. First of all, the architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, which already means what happens in the womb already has an impact on you. So if your mother is stressed and she's got high levels of stress hormone, that's already affecting your brain development. And when you think of all the stressed pregnant women out there, no wonder we're seeing so many kids in trouble. And we know from American studies, international studies, that when mothers are stressed, their placenta will naturally have more cortisol and adrenaline, the stress hormone. Those kids will be more likely to have stress issues later on, abnormal stress hormone levels even at 1 year of age, behavioral problems, learning problems, and so on. Which tells us a lot as to why adopted kids have so many more problems. That's another issue. But the next paragraph is key. The interactions of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain and is critically influenced by, in other words, the circuitry, the chemistry of the brain, and which centers and which circuits and which systems develop, and which neurochemicals will be present in what quantities, depends on the early environment, and is critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years. In other words, the most important influence shaping the physiological development of the brain is the quality of parent-child relationships. Now, when parents are stressed or distracted or workaholics, like I was a young parent, if there's instability, economic troubles, relationship troubles, unresolved trauma on the part of the parent, loving parents who are just stressed, that'll interfere with the child's brain development. That's why we're seeing so much more ADHD now, so much more autism, and so much more other problems, because of stress in society that affects the parenting environment. In other words, yes, there's physiological problems with the brain, but it's not a genetic issue. It's related to early experience. So when you look at brain scans of adults that are troubled brain scans, as you do in addicts, you're not just looking at the impact of addiction, you're also looking at the impact of childhood trauma and childhood stress. And this has been shown over and over and over and over again. So there's no separation between the physiology and the psychology. So if you come to me as an addict and you say, I got such and such, and I ask you, what does it do for you? And you say it numbs the pain, then my question is, where did you develop the pain? What happened? And then we have an inquiry. And now it no longer becomes a shameful thing that you chose this, nor does it mean that you're stuck with it because you got this genetic problem. We get it as an adaptive response to something that happened, and we can heal that. The reason why addiction treatment is failing is because physicians don't understand this. They keep dealing with the effects, which is the addiction, and the behaviors, which are the effects of the addiction, but not the cause, which is the childhood distress. And the impact of childhood distress that carry into adulthood, in other words, how we stay prisoners of childhood. And so present methods of treatment in psychiatry, in addiction medicine, in childhood psychiatry deal with effects rather than causes. And this is why we're so ineffective at it.